Admission, admit and admission, and so there were a whole bunch of there were lots. Admit and others were out there. Hi. Yes.
So I know that the master's thing was really first time meeting, but I'm not looking at the masters. I'm just looking to see if it's just above the bachelor's that doesn't go on the master's. That's what that's.
But let me ask you a question.
Yes.
So your previous.
Well, actually, no. I'm interdisciplinary studies.
Oh, okay, okay. So yes, the certificate is passed. The difference is it's really kind of focused on adult. The MA and yeah, not everybody. Now, the nice part about it is, the really nice part about it is you can come in and you can take those first 4 classes and then if you change your mind, you can finish the certificate and we'll all 6 of them. But you don't have to. I have a lot of students who come in and they do exactly that. I have some students who come in with an MA, mine one. Yeah, it's 6 courses and a shorter capstone. Capstone is why basically the same with and the MA have the same practical program. The other thing to do is
Okay. So then do I wait till I treat my grants for them to apply, or can I just push go?
already somewhere else.
No.
You really do. So what you have to do is you have to be a graduate student. And you get one. Ways to do that. One is like eBay, every transcript equals. And you have if you find yourself in a problem, and get all that together in one place. The graduate student temporarily use really one.
You said 6 altogether, right? So that would be, okay.
And so your first 3 you can do as a student or empathy that
Okay, okay.
and you have to reapply. But the second time you quit, you have to have all.
Right. All right. So to go as a student at large, too much fun.
You talk to anybody, you just basically you go into the application, and one of the application options is graduate student help.
Okay.
As opposed to going through a program as a graduate student.
Okay.
Yeah. I know it sounds kind of weird, but just the way.
The whole thing is
But oftentimes, I would tell you, if you want to, you've got plenty of time. say that other one is kind of a hip pocket secret way to get in on time. Because you can get into much less paper. But in doing so, you So, like I said, the nice part about the way the program was set up is you've got 6 courses. So, yeah. And you get to the end, right, which I've done that, you don't have a list, and then do is just send me these.
Okay.
Well, of course.
No, it's super. All manageable.
Yeah, well, typically, as an undergraduate, it takes 4 or 5 to be a full-time student.
Yeah.
Graduate students.
Oh,
So most people don't get that. It's assuming you want.
all right.
Okay. That's no.
We are. Down here. Today. Yeah, treating so late. Yeah, you were. I'd like to introduce a special guest we have with us today. Dr. Sendam Lee is here with our class today. Has anyone had a class with Dr. Lee? She is a faculty member in the TESL program, probably mostly practical, right? Yeah. But she's just here to observe what we're up to today. 41. Questions about the world of TESL that any of your instructors have so far haven't been able to answer to your satisfaction. Dr. Lee would be the one to talk to. She's originally from South Korea. Her focus in research and special assessment. So how we assess English learners and other learners. So do you want to say anything before we start? No, thanks for having me, Annie. I'm glad to be here. We have one more student who will probably. So welcome to week 11. You're already here this far. Hope this semester is feeling still doable for all of you. On our agenda for this week, first we'll check in about what your tasks are for week 11. I'll give you a little reminder about next week, and then our main focus for this week is on communicative competence and chapter 8 in our practice. So checking in, your tasks for this week are pretty typical. So I put in D2L a video lecture of this week's material, similar to last week. I'm just not sure how much of this week's lecture we'll get through actually in class. So for your sort of asynchronous online portion of the week, I'll post. Last week I did this as well. I posted like start at minute 11:11 because that's where we left off in class. I'll do something similar after we finish today to tell you where in the video you start watching. So it'll probably be about 10 minutes or so that you'll need to watch. And then as usual, there's a quiz. The journal entry G is due, so I think that means it's the fifth to last. They started. You helped me check last week. It was like, yeah. Okay, that's right. So second to last of your journal entries. Then there's a couple of video ants on communicative competence. So the first annotation will be Saturday. Your last week class needs to be Monday. And just as a reminder,
next Tuesday is election day, so the university will be closed. There's no classes at all on Tuesday next week. So just make sure to check E2L for all of your activities for next week. It'll be pretty similar to a lot of our weeks, but there will be a video lecture, there's a discussion board, and then like before, quiz and a journal entry for your I think that would be the last journal entry that's the whole project. But just make sure it's all in the task list for week 12 next week. So just have a look at that. And if you're eligible voters, please vote next week. It is a very important part of our democracy. Get out there and do your civic duty. But all the polling places are already open for early voting, so there's really no excuse not to vote. You're looking at me skeptically. Who has voted already? Okay, so we've got some work to do, people. Make it happen. And they say too, you always have to make a plan to vote, or you just won't. Like if you don't specifically plan, okay, I'm gonna get up early and go do it before work, or I'm gonna go early this weekend and vote. Hi, Mandy, come on in. But if you don't make an actual plan, often that day just gets away from you, you don't vote. So try to make sure you do that. Not even try, commit to making sure that you vote. Mandy, have you voted yet? Sorry, you go. Okay. Well, if you're an eligible voter, I surely hope you'll do that. The university is closed next Tuesday for election day. We won't be having class. So for the class, make sure you check the task list for all the things you get to do. But if you're an eligible voter. Any questions on this week or next?
How many more journals?
So this week is G, next week is H. What's happening with your project?
Like more bad news from the doctor, and then everything's falling out. So it's like
Mostly light stuff.
mostly like stuff.
Well, actually, so their term project is this. I'm saying this for your benefit, Dr. Lee, and I introduced. This is our other student, Mandy. We have Dr. Simon visiting us today. So their term project is doing a self-directed language learning project, and they have 8 journal entries they have to do. Mandy is teaching himself Korean, and Dr.
Don't try.
Dr. Lee's originally from South Korea, so if you have any specific questions about issues that happen, she might be able to answer them.
I'm gonna worry about my health right now.
You probably also thought I did post your grades on the midterm. I left specific feedback for a number of the things in there. So, and that's true of almost all of your assignments that I post grades to. So have a look in the rubric because you'll see specific feedback in specific sections. Some of you did very well. Some of you probably didn't do as well as you would hope. Sometimes that happens with one of these take-home exams. You misunderstood a question or you didn't answer it fully. I'll just say that there's still those few journal entries that are left, as well as quizzes, asynchronous assignments, and our final exam at the end of the semester. So if you're not happy with where things are in terms of your grade, there are multiple opportunities to still get better grades on those things coming up and improve. Andrew, you have a funny look at your face. All right. Questions about that?
It's the final gonna be multiple choice.
It is not. It's going to be somewhat similar to the midterm in that it'll be a writing assignment,
Oh, I like that.
but fewer questions, more asking you to think more reflectively about everything we've looked at this last semester and your teaching practice sort of going forward. But so yeah, it'll be a writing assignment. It won't be like multiple choice. And similar to the midterm, you'll have 2 weeks to work on it. So I'm getting into our focus for today on communicative competence. So in chapter 8 of Brown, the reading for today, we sort of build on last week. We looked a lot at the idea of culture and how we are as people shaped by the culture that we're part of, and how our cultural context often shapes our experience of language learning. And this kind of builds on that idea nicely with the notion that our real goal for our students in learning another language is that they become able to use it in real life meaningful communication. And that's what the idea of community competence is. So looking a little bit about this concept of the word competence, the concept of what it means to be competent in a language has actually evolved over time. Going back to Chomsky, we talked about him in this class. He really reacted against the behavioralists. Those are the folks who said your brain is just this blank slate when you're born. And he said, no, actually, all humans are born with this innate ability to acquire language. That's sort of what it means to be, or an important part of what it means to be human. We have this language acquisition device in our brain, and all of the input that we take in gets organized by it, and we learn to use a language. But he kind of broke that into two notions. The first was competence, so that he defined as kind of this underlying knowledge of the system of language. It's what's happening in your brain, what you know. So things like the rules of grammar and vocabulary, how those pieces all fit together. And in your native language, his idea was that you implicitly know all of these rules. And even if you can't articulate them, even if you can't describe what those rules are, you know how to use them more or less perfectly. So competence, as Chomsky defined it, was largely intrapersonal. So it's like within yourself, in your own brain. And he differentiated that from performance. Your language performance is what you could actually produce, what other people could observe. So what you're able to say, what you're able to read, what we can observe you comprehending in terms of your listening, what you're able to write. That's your language performance. And that's largely interpersonal or between more than one person. So that was Chomsky in 1965. This was how he kind of defined competence versus performance. Then in the next decade, Hines came along and built on that idea. He said that there was first linguistic competence, and Hines's linguistic competence was very similar to Chomsky's competence. And again, that was this underlying knowledge about grammar, about vocabulary, about how those pieces fit together, what's in your brain. But then Hines added the notion of communicative competence, which emphasized more of the social and the cultural nature of language use. So our ability to both convey and interpret messages that are, again, context specific. So they're specific to the situation that you're in and specific to the culture that you're communicating in. And he said there's degrees of competence. So different from Chomsky, there's no real like ideal or perfect language user. There's a range of degrees of competence. And that that community competence is the knowledge that enables the use of language. So not just sort of what you have in your brain as its innate ability, but what you're able to do with it in a specific context and situation. And then a little bit farther in the next decade, Canale and Swain came along with this even more expanded view of competence, which included first grammatical competence. And again, that was really kind of like Chomsky's competence and Hines' linguistic competence, that underlying understanding of grammar and vocabulary, but specifically at the sentence level. But he added then the idea of discourse competence. So rather than just sort of individual utterances or individual sentences, he thought of it in terms of larger discourses. So entire conversations, or even written discourse. So like an entire book or longer piece of writing. Beyond just being able to string a singular sentence together, it could be both, like I say, either written or spoken, longer discourse. A couple other ideas that Kelly and Swain added were sociolinguistic competence, which again, that's similar to Heinz's communicative competence, which focus on this idea of being able to follow social conventions or use the language that's appropriate for different situations. That is context dependent. So thinking of what kind of language do we use depending on the roles of the participants, the function of the interaction, and the type of information. So if you think of the roles of the participants, think of, most of you probably have a job or have had a job in the past, right? Think about your boss. Now think about how you talk to your boss when you're at work. What are some features of the language that you use with your boss when you're at work? Okay, so not using expletives, okay, minding your appropriate choice of vocabulary, okay.
Including slang.
So you wouldn't really use slang or you would? No, okay.
Let's say it would depend on how close you are. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay, maybe. So maybe it depends on that, the specific kind of level of familiarity in that relationship. But maybe it also depends too on talking to your boss at work versus maybe at a party or some kind of social function that you both would end up in, probably because of work or maybe just maybe you would talk to your boss differently in one of those contexts than you would in the other. Would you have you? I don't know if any of you have had an experience like that, but maybe a supervisor, the way you talk to them in the job, and then if there's drinks later or something like this, you might talk a little bit differently. It might be a little more relaxed. Can anyone think of an example? Yeah, Mandy.
So when I first worked in middle school, the first year, I don't know, it opened up about different viewpoints of teachers.
Okay.
As students were not, teachers are just like, they're only here to teach us blah blah blah. But then, like the first time we gathered as teachers, I was technology systems. It was on October.
Okay.
So, like, so it was really interesting to see the other side because we see teachers as like leaders, as the head of the class, the head of the pack, and stuff like that. But like seeing them relax, seeing them having fun, seeing them like this, that, it's like they're normal just like us. It made me feel that, for example, the biggest thing I tell younger students is that the teachers are always on side because before us, they set up this test. They had the experience that we had. And that's why the teachers work with us. And just seeing that, like, yeah, that even reinforces my belief that teachers went through what we went.
Right. So there's your perception of this whole group of people being these sort of authorities that sit in this like very highly regarded position. You came to understand a greater sort of, in a different sort of phase of life or something, came to understand a more equality or more egalitarian kind of understanding. They've also had a similar, education, and they've had their own journey in that experience. Yeah. So again, the roles of the participants, but then also the function of that interaction, and maybe even the type of information, right? We might use different kinds of language if we're conveying.
The culture as well.
What do you mean?
Right now, one of my bosses, the student union, is Mexican. So with him, I find it easier to talk.
Okay.
Even though he's my boss, I find it easier to talk. Sometimes we talk in Spanish, sometimes there's no professional lingo between us. But I know that I gotta respect him. I know that he's still my boss. So like there's still that presence of like he is the boss. But just because like we get along, I can get away with like speaking that way, speaking to him, no?
So because you have a shared cultural background, there's sort of roles that you have already been negotiated between the two of you, so it allows for a shared context in which you can communicate in a different way than if you didn't have a shared
Oh, no,
culture.
definitely, completely, because, as I mentioned before, the whole class, the whole fact that whoever's older than me, we're touched with respect, regardless of who it was. So even though he lets me get away with some of the language, I know that I'm not supposed to say certain things in front of him.
Okay,
So,
right.
like, I have to, like, I'm not gonna go all out Mandy with friends mode, you know?
Right,
Versus like, he acknowledges me as a friend, but he's still my boss.
Right.
So there still has to be that sort of respect. Plus, he's older than me, so there's even more respect.
the different layers
Yeah.
of that kind of both your roles and then your functions, and that negotiated within already a sort of culturally appropriate understanding of each other.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then even sometimes like the type of information will shape the way that the kind of language we use. If we're conveying bad news or good news, sort of regardless of some of these other pieces, we use different kind of language, right? Canali Swain also added this idea of strategic competence. Which is the idea that you know how to communicate, how to achieve what you want to with language, even when there are maybe gaps in your grammatical competence. So even for a person who's using a second language, in which they don't have a high level of proficiency, if they have either verbal or nonverbal ways of compensating for breakdowns in communication, making repairs, sustaining communication in order to achieve what they're trying to do with language, that's understood to be strategic competence. The ability to use language and all of their other sort of communicative ability to get their meaning across, even if there's breakdowns. And then Commons in 1980 perhaps provided something that might be a more useful model when we're thinking about competence, which are the idea of BICS and CALC. So BICS is short for Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills. It's the kind of language that we use typically in our day-to-day communication. Less formal, more sort of functional. And for a person learning a second language, usually in your L2, it's possible to develop BICS, or the Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills, maybe in about a 2-year time frame. Again, that's dependent on a lot of other variables, including the age of the learner, how many hours you have dedicated to learning a day or a week, etc. But approximately 2 years, the amount of time you would need to develop BICS in a second language. As opposed to CALC, which is what we know to be cognitive academic language proficiency. So this is really more of an academic language skills across all 4 skills, so reading, writing, as well as listening and speaking. And developing CALC typically is thought to take 7 to 10 years in a second language if you ever develop it. Many people sort of master BICS, and that's enough for what their purposes are. For CALC, it's a much higher threshold. Commons later started using the language of context embedded versus context reduced for BICS and CALC. Sort of replaced the word BICS and CALC with the notion of context embedded and context reduced. Why do you think those phrases were used to describe BICS and CALC? For example, context embedded for BICS. Break those words down. What is context? What do I mean by the word context?
What does context?
Word that you use to
I think I see what you're getting at. Keep going, keep going.
just like context clues. So you move words around are
Yeah. So often when we think about reading skills, we talk about using your context clues to figure out the meaning of an unfamiliar word, right? And we say that because the context is kind of the information surrounding it, right? If we have one unfamiliar word, we don't know what this means, but let me read the rest of the sentence, or maybe the sentences around it to try and figure out what does the context clues tell us about that unknown word. Yeah. So it's the similar idea here. Context means kind of the things happening around the thing you're looking at, right? So if these basic interpersonal communication is happening often in interpersonal communication. So since they're daily living kind of communication, it's an interaction you're having with your boss. It's an interaction you're having with the bus driver. It's an interaction you're having with the person from whom you're ordering coffee. It's in a context, a social context in which there's a lot of facial expressions. There's a lot of that working together to negotiate a breakdown in communication, maybe with gestures. Yeah, man.
So, if I'm right, context reduced basically at that point and level, you know what you're talking about, you know how to identify it, and you know how to respond to it. So at that point, you wouldn't have to think with context. The context reduced for the basic and personal context embedded. That basically relates to the whole scripted language learning. So we have our guide, how are you? Good. And that's the context that we're building upon. That we have those guides at the beginning, in between those 2 years of development of the language, that we have reference on how to answer these questions. So once we move away from the context embedded,
I think I'm following what you're saying, and I think there's some similar. I think you're right in a way.
like I said,
I think you're right in a way. So when we move from VIX to CAL and kind of called CAL more context reduced, he's saying that often academic language happens in situations that don't involve a lot of context. You're reading a textbook and the author's not there to see the confused look on your face if you're not understanding what's on the page. There's no interlocutor or other person that you can communicate with in real time to work on some of those breakdowns in communication. There's specifically no social context to help the student understand when they don't understand, when there is a breakdown in communication. Whereas again, the idea of VIX, it being a lot of interpersonal communication, there's the context with your nonverbal communication, gestures, potentially the use of realia or other items in your setting to establish meaning. Whereas in health, again, especially with a lot of reading or writing, a lot of information and vocabulary that's sort of standardized across academic contexts, it's much more context reduced. There aren't those same resources to find meaning. And another way of thinking about competence is the view of language functions. Language functions are basically purposes that we accomplish with language. So to help me think about, if you think of the idea of language functions, things that you try to accomplish or make happen using language, what are some of the functions that you try to use language to accomplish? Things you try to make happen with language. Yeah, go ahead, Manny.
it goes back to the whole academic language, business language.
Okay.
So if we're trying to learn something, learn the subject for everything.
Okay, so to learn maybe academic content.
Precisely.
Uh-huh.
And from business, the business English, like you mentioned it, work with other people that are in similar business.
Okay.
environment.
And think about specifically that business environment. What are some of the things that you're trying to do with language in that environment?
Close deals,
Ah.
product, just communicate basic interactions within the business.
Okay, good. Those are good specific functions that you're trying to accomplish with language in that context, in a business context. What other kinds of functions, things that you try to accomplish using language? Valentina?
So back to the whole project learning.
Yeah.
The thing that I'm using is repetition. Like I keep repeating the word, keep repeating the language in order for me to function in the language. I guess.
Yeah, so you're doing a lot of repetition to try and memorize,
Yeah.
or okay. And you're memorizing in like what are the kinds of phrases you've been memorizing so that you can hopefully use them in Polish? Polish is the language you've chosen, right? So what kinds of phrases have you been trying to memorize, if you can remember some?
Both.
Yeah. Like introductions, or are they like greetings? Are they?
Yeah, so basically reading.
Okay.
Trying to communicate, using a lot of vocabularies.
But vocabulary related to what? Like a grocery store, a restaurant, a library? What can you think of?
So basic it's mixed.
Okay.
Most of it is like reading, like how would you say like your name and the weather or something like that.
That's a good one. Talking about the weather. Because, and this kind of gets us into a different idea, but it's related. When we talk to someone about the weather, when we say like, oh, it's so sunny today, it's beautiful. What are we doing? Very good, Valentina. So we're not really actually talking about the sunny day, making a meteorological observation. What we're really doing is trying to open up communication, right? Establish social connection, right? We're trying to find a way to talk about something that's neutral, not really important, in order to sort of grease the wheels, as we say, to use an idiom, right? To sort of allow us to maybe talk about other things down the road that are more important than the weather or something else that's neutral. Good. What are some other things that we try to accomplish with language? Things that we try to make happen with language.
She works in the school.
Uh-huh.
So her English pretty much revolves around
Yeah. So it's very context specific, right? Uh-huh.
once she gets out of that situation of cooking and serving food.
Yeah.
Then very good at it.
Which is kind of a result of her having this very specific context in which she's using this language and probably very few other contexts, right?
It's like following
Uh-huh.
you know, they tell you what this word this has to do with cooking and baking. Oh, it's on
I worked at a deli when I was a teenager, and to this day, I can tell you a lot of like very specific Spanish vocabulary around like Jewish deli sandwiches. And, like, because it was all, written like all the like, like everything had an image and had English and Spanish on all of it. So that's just still in there. Again, this very specific context. I'm not sure if that's exactly what I'm getting at in terms of language functions, but it's very relevant to this idea of the context embedded idea of the fix that she could use, right? Some of the other functions or things that we try to accomplish with language include these things: making declarations or stating. That's just very simple kind of saying facts or information, but also making requests, responding to either requests or other kinds of things that to us, asking questions, reading or parting, saying goodbye, accepting, declining, agreeing, disagreeing. Those last three in particular are very sort of culturally specific. The way that we do those last three functions of language can be very different from one culture to another. And that's where we can make a lot of mistakes, sometimes using a second language for those last three. You have a little grin on your face.
Isn't it supposed to? Really? Yes.
ESTABLI, I think so. Established. I mean, my handwriting's not great. How would you spell it?
Without the E.
Just established?
Yeah.
Oh.
That's bothering me.
I think that's language
It's
interference,
language interference, yeah.
right? In Espanol, he was
Yeah.
very, you want to put the E on it, so maybe that's why you're trying to take it off, right?
It is.
Like you, like
Stop.
at school and stop and all these kinds of things. So it really does belong.
It's bothering me. You barely see a word in that would be in.
But yes, especially as
Really?
well, that's two words. Like we have both especially. Like I made it specially for you, but you could also say I'm especially glad to see you. Yeah, those are both words.
My brain hurts.
Sorry to say. So with these last three, like I said, they're significantly culturally situated. Can you think of ways that you do these language functions in one language you know that's very different from another language you know, and that doing it wrong in one or the other can really be offensive? But we're gonna take it back. Someone said something and I think they want to, but I wasn't sure. But I thought, well, I'm just asking. And I'm well, have to put that in my way. So yeah, so even I would think that is a way you're using language to functionally shut down whatever this person was trying to say, or to decline whatever this person was trying to say, by saying nothing at all. I think that is a way that you're. And it's multiple ways to greet someone. Say hello. Yeah, like all that. Yeah. Mhm. Other ways specifically with those last three that you have found are very different from maybe one language you know and another language you know, and that sort of mixing them up or treating maybe agreeing or disagreeing the way you appropriately do that in one language is very.
I don't know if this is really a big difference, but in my family, you need the family gathering without having kids.
Everybody.
You're mad at that. So you can say that this, because then they'll be like, oh, man. Yeah, so I don't know how it's like, but it's my ex-husband's family, which is, you know, just, I don't know, American or not, but what it's something different than what I grew up in. It was, they were very like taken aback when I would go up to them. And I got my in-laws, my sister-in-law, brother-in-law, my mother-in-law, father-in-law, and I would go up to them and I mean, it's just like I was my family. And then I would be like, I'm talking to her. And I thought, oh, I guess everybody see each other this way. I assumed everybody did have that. Yeah. Italian, but
Okay, okay, so more, yeah. So, and I would say, yeah, that is a very, I mean, I don't know, if maybe your family like kind of extra.
No.
No, okay, okay, thank you for being my culture. No, I think that's exactly it. I think within the specific culture and language milieu there's one very established way of arting that's quite different from what the Greek. Even though it's almost like you can't pick, right? If you wanted to leave with your own family, like you start your clock now, folks, 1 hour, spin around, and then the other day,
you just say like a overall bye, and then it's cool.
yeah, no,
And to me, it's so weird to get adjusted to that.
Yeah.
So weird.
So these are all functions, things that we accomplish with language, but it's not universal, right? It looks different in both different languages and different cultural contexts. So we can't really separate this. Sometimes the form of a language, like a declaration or a question, doesn't match how it's intended to function. I'll say that again. Sometimes the form of what you say, maybe it's a statement, maybe it's a question in form, but it doesn't match the function of what you're trying to achieve with it. So for example, he bought a car. That functions as a statement and it's pretty much, so the form of that is a statement and it pretty much functions as a statement. We're sharing this information. He bought a car. And how much does that cost? For the most part, that form is a question and the function is requesting information about the price of a car. But what about fees? I've lost my wallet. In form, what is it? What would we say? Some kind of exclamation, right? But what is the function of saying this other?
You lost your one. Try to inform everyone.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Maybe, so it's more almost of a request. Can you help me? A request or maybe a what's the word? When you're accusing, maybe an accusation or a request for help. So we're usually not just trying to share some information that I lost my wallet. Hey, we're requesting something. We're making some kind of plea, usually, right? So the form doesn't match the function. I want that toy. What is it in form? Statement of fact. I want that toy. What is the function of? What are they trying to accomplish by saying?
To annoy you.
Maybe to annoy, but why? What's
They
the
want
purpose?
to- they want to-
It's maybe a request or maybe even a little worse, like a demand, right?
Depends on the way you say it.
Say a little bit more about what you mean, Fabian.
So if you say, I want that. Like, you're demanding something. Versus like, oh, I want that toy. And I think,
Uh-huh. Ooh, I want that toy. I want that toy. Right? So in some ways, the intonation, the volume, the way that we say it can change the function as well. You want a piece of me? What is it in form?
He's angry.
No, this just looking at the form though, like the words, if you string them together, you want a piece of me? The question, right? Meaning.
You got a problem with it?
If you try to make it on its face value, it doesn't make a ton of sense, right? But so what is the function typically when you hear a phrase like this?
probably more like, if someone was thinking of the people,
Ah,
and then like, if one of them, I
mhm.
definitely.
That's how you understand that, Teresa. How about you? Oh, interesting. So when you read this phrase, you want a piece of me, you think they're saying like, would you like to spend time with me? Anyone else understand this phrase differently? Hang on, Angel, go ahead. Usually, yeah, that's how I know the function of this phrase could be like a threat or like a dare almost, right? Like the twisting, or was it Seinfeld? Costanza's father? Did anyone watch Seinfeld? I don't know if anyone was alive in the 90s, but. It's like I'm a big man and I'm gonna fight you. You want a piece of me?
I was saying the same thing. I was like, those are fighting words.
Those are fighting
Yeah,
words,
those are
yeah.
fighting words. In fact, the function here is to threaten or to intimidate, right? What about this? On its face, what's the form? It's maybe a command, right? Like, shut up, telling someone to be quiet. But what's the function? When you think of what you're trying to accomplish, if you say that phrase, what you're trying to make happen. Stop someone from talking, maybe. Other ideas? That's how you heard that phrase. Yeah. Just say it how you would say it if you were how you would process that function. Yeah, right?
No, you shut up.
What else? What else? Think about how you heard that phrase used and what was the function?
Outside of fear, you mean?
Angry. Like,
Usually it's not very polite, but you don't go around and shut up.
so one function is to sort of, and what do you do? What do you say even when you're angry? What are you trying to functionally accomplish like that?
Like an exclamation, like a, I don't think
Are you saying that you want someone to stop talking? Shut up. Or are you saying, what are you trying to make happen? Okay.
what else did you use?
I don't think, okay, go ahead.
Expression of surprise. Shut up.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
See?
You went and saw.
Shut up. No way.
So this same form, right? Shut up, had at least 4 different functions that we just identified, and I think we could probably come up with a lot more, depending on the context, depending on how is that volume, intonation, who's talking and to whom. All of those different factors can influence what the function is that we're trying to accomplish with language. And that's important, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on, but that's important because for people learning any second language, but we're here thinking about how to teach English, helping them to understand these functions of language is critical to their communicative competence, to their ability to understand and use the language in a way that's going to actually allow them to meaningfully communicate that. So if our students know this phrase, shut up, but they hear it as that, right? They hear, wait, I just got some good news about who was this awesome concert, and you told me to stop talking. I'm very confused, right? It's important that we help our students to understand that sometimes there's phrases that mean something different than what they look like on their face, right? That even if they can string those words together, shut up, and I think that means stop talking, but then someone just said it when we were laughing and talking, like, oh, shut up. And I don't know why. Helping our students understand this. This is kind of the whole part of linguistics that's known as pragmatics, or how we use language to communicate. That's higher than just sort of the level of grammar, being able to put the words together, higher than the specific what does the vocabulary word mean, but how do we actually use that language to communicate in real and meaningful ways?
Funny you mentioned this happened maybe in the weekend.
Okay.
We're talking about how words have lost their meaning. For example, swear words seem to sting less than they used to,
Uh-huh.
and other words seem to sting more than they used to. So we were having a conversation, and I called one of my friends loser.
Oh.
He went off on me. Like he went off on me. Everyone was laughing. Like we were all laughing because he thought loser was something really, really bad. So he went off on me. And all my friends, they're like, why are you guys laughing? This is serious.
So somehow this word
Yeah,
that you took to be sort of milder has taken on like a harsher
Yeah,
meaning.
He's a younger person too. No, but we're all laughing. It's funny because like he like realized he was really hurt. He was really angry. He went off. He called me something that was really mean. But I was too busy laughing that like no, I didn't take it seriously. We're all laughing at him. It's funny because like, he realized and he's like, oh, I'm sorry.
And so that's true, right? So that's a piece of pragmatics also, the idea that the sort of strengths of words can change over time, the relative sort of forcefulness. And words, yeah, like words that would have been considered expletives at a certain point become more socially acceptable over time.
Rather socially ineffective.
And therefore maybe less effective, maybe, right? Or to carry the punch that you were looking
Oh, yeah,
for.
like before, those are fighting words. Now they're like everywhere. You don't care about them anymore.
Right, even this sort of, you want a piece of me, like at a certain point, that would have been like a serious threat. Now it's almost a joke because this guy said, right? Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Oh, yeah. And that's what we were laughing because we thought he was messing around, but he really did get offended.
Yeah, so a lot of this is really context specific, and there can be, that's obviously a breakdown in communication, right? The way that you perceive that word's strength or meaning was different from his. Yeah. There's 7 other language functions that Halliday identified. This is in Brown chapter 8. One is the instrumental function of language. So this is when the words that we say actually cause something to happen. So when an officiant at a wedding says, I now pronounce you husband and wife, they are actually making that marriage happen by saying that. That's instrumental function of language. Sometimes language can be regulatory or control events by the force of saying them. So if a parent says to their child, do your chores or no screen time, by saying that, they establish sort of the conditions that will allow for one or the other thing to happen. They actually regulate what's acceptable or what's possible based on what they say. Representational function, that's just conveying information. So water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a very straightforward function of language to just represent something that is true. An interactional function of language establishes social contact and keeps communication open. So this is like what Tina was saying about talking about the weather. We're not actually, like I said, making a representational commentary on the weather. What we're actually doing is trying to establish contact and keep communication open. So things like, how have you been? Nice weather today. Well, that's interesting. On their faces, we're saying these, asking a question or making these statements or requesting information, these kinds of things, but that's not actually the function of what we're trying to accomplish. What we're trying to accomplish is just this establishment of a personal function that Halliday identified was just the opportunity to vent an emotion. So when someone just said something like, I hate this job, or life sucks, they're not necessarily even commenting on their job or their life, so much that they're just letting out emotion. That's that function of using that language. The heuristic function of language, which is a language used to try and acquire knowledge. So asking some questions like, why do dogs sniff trees? Or what temperature does the pizza bake at? They're actually just trying to get information. That's the function of these. And then he identifies the imaginative function of language. So this is creating ideas, things like poetry, telling stories, telling jokes specifically. This is a joke that I heard. I'd like to try fried beans. They might be the same as refried beans. We can say the time. Thank you, Rachel. So we break down the joke. Who's ever heard of fried beans? That's not really a thing. Refried beans, that's a Mexican way of preparing beans. I don't really know the whole process, but the joke is like, maybe we didn't need to refry them. Maybe it was in the first time.
I always wonder about that.
Were they frying the first place?
I don't know if they know the restaurant, but it's not right.
No, I've been told that.
But the function of jokes is more this sort of imaginative function, right? So it's not, I'm not actually trying to, it's not this heuristic function where I'm trying to actually figure out if there's such a thing as fried beans. I want to save some time, not having to refry the beans. It's just a silly joke. And that's again the function of telling. Related to language functions is the idea that beyond understanding words and using grammar appropriately, again, we need these pragmatic skills to become competent in discourse or in conversation. So some of the pieces of discourse competence or conversation competence are being able to use language to do things like get attention. So students have to be actually taught how to do that. If you need to get attention, you can say something like, excuse me, or got a minute, or by the way. And a lot of these things will be really specific, again, what's appropriate in terms of the context, in terms of who they're talking to, in terms of the setting, these kinds of factors. Students actually have to be taught things like topic nomination or how to sort of start a topic of conversation. So it's cold today, isn't it? Or did you see the new Marvel movie? There's ways that we seem to know how to start a new topic in a conversation, but that aren't, again, they're not the same from one language or one cultural context to another. Also topic development or how to hold the floor to things like, well, what I mean is, or even, and I had a student in a brief section when I taught the passive language. We have to teach students to say, seems counterintuitive. But then he came back a week or two later and was like, so actually, I worked in a coffee shop and someone who was using English as a second language came into order and conversation broke down and then they were just totally silent. And it was terrible. and you realize in that moment, this is what you meant, like how to keep sort of communication going, how to repair the breakdown. Sometimes our students need to have phrases even like or, well, what I mean is something that they know how to say to indicate, I'm thinking, stay with me.
And that's actually a skill. That's actually a discourse skill that students need to be able to use to keep conversation going. Turn taking, so how to sort of give the discourse over to the other person. Well, don't you think? How about you? And therefore sort of seeding your term in the discourse. How to ask for clarification. What was that? Or what does mean? I see your point, but how to repair. So if there's a breakdown and there was a misunderstanding, then how to kind of bring it back together. Oh, right. Okay. Shifting or avoiding or interrupting. So sort of changing the direction that we're going in a conversation. Well, speaking of movies, pardon me, but and then ultimately termination, how to end the conversation. Well, I have to get going, or great talking with you, but I've got to run. There's a lot of different ways to do all these different sort of, again, functions within conversation or discourse. But we have to think really intentionally about how to teach our students to do these things. Because it's not just sort of the grammar and vocabulary rules of English that they'll piece together. It's how we use language in really important interpersonal ways in discourse. This last one I think is really funny too, because you really do. It's very similar actually to what Tony was talking about, how can you leave the party? What's the appropriate way to part, right? I think of just even like how difficult it is to get off the phone with my grandmother.
That's rude.
Oh, and I don't know why, but just like I'll start to do what I think is a very clear, like, well, probably better get going now. And then, like, gosh, it was sure great to talk to you. It was a miracle, really, that you called me. And gosh, just can't imagine what you're up to these days. And, and then she'll just start on her mind will take her a different direction, and I'll have to kind of bring her back again. And so anyway, Grandma, okay, now I'm going to let you go. That's right. Oh, God bless you. Thank you for calling. And I think too, but I also, so in my other role here at the university, where I manage our intensive English program, I get a lot of just inquiries from interested international students all over the world. And I had this one who would call me on our WhatsApp number. I had to just stop answering it because he just wanted, it just became clear he just kind of wanted to talk to somebody in English. There was no way that he was ever actually going to come study in our program. But similarly, trying to just, okay, I've answered all of your questions. Thanks so much for calling. And similarly, oh yes. And when I call you next time, we'll talk more about this. And such a good time talking. God bless you. Why does God bless you always seem to come into my It's just again, this how to end. Maybe that's a common, way in nature. You would say these things as part of parting, but again, this idea that we have to teach our students appropriate ways to terminate and end. That is right, yeah. Or you don't have to do complexity in that. You don't have to. It could be kind of open-ended, right? Yep. So, yes, so I know the person I want to communicate with is very chatty and it's difficult to terminate the conversation. I would say, well, again, with our strategic competence, right? You have learned this. I will be strategically able to do this. But also the other way around, it can also feel really wrong. doesn't know how to do these things, like, okay, well, I gotta get going. Thank you so much. See you later. Bye. And they just like you answered a question and they just say, okay, bye. That also doesn't feel right. There wasn't a fully appropriate parting that happened there. So again, this idea of it's almost like we know what it looks like when it feels wrong, right? But our students don't. So just to be sort of like hoping that they'll feel it out doesn't help. Doesn't help.
It's funny because we have a coworker like that. He just leaves. Like everyone's like, have a good day, see you tomorrow, and everything. He just leaves.
Yeah.
Like, what's wrong with him? He's mad at me. Yeah, he's mad at me. I didn't get a hug.
Also in chapter 8, Brown talks about Juice's idea of different discourse styles. So there are many different styles that we use language for in a variety of languages, but in different situations. And we typically know how to use them appropriately, but those things are not, again, they have to be taught. So they identified the several different styles, the first of which was an oratorical style. So usually in an oratory, it's one person speaking to many. It's a very formal style of speaking. I think Winston Churchill up here in the left, leader in Great Britain during the Second World War. But he's known to be a very dramatic orator. And so his style is very formal. There's a lot of exaggerated intonation. The words themselves, the discourse itself is very carefully planned. Kind of below that, in a sort of thinking about levels of formality, is a deliberative style that Juice identified, which was one to many again, but less polished, maybe more typical of like a formal lecture being given to an audience. A consultative style is, they identified as more sort of one-on-one or maybe a few to a few, less planned, something like a doctor visit or a business meeting. Again, much less formal than casual discourse. So that's kind of happens between friends, between colleagues or family members. It's typically not planned. There's very low social barriers in that style. And then the most casual, not really the right word, but the on the lowest level of formality was an intimate style. So between close family members or friends or lovers, it's very spontaneous, and it's the kind of style in which your most inner self would be revealed to someone else. Can you think, when you think about then these different styles that you see here, we would use kind of different vocabulary, maybe different even sort of grammar forms, if we're speaking in one style versus another. Can you think of an example of something you might say, some ways in which the casual style would be different than, say, a deliberative style? Some features of language within one of those styles that would be different from another. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. So those first two especially would be typically more scripted, whereas the bottom two, not really scripted, right? What other differences?
Well, as it says, deliberate, it's less polished, but probably like basic communication, trying to get to a location, trying to find a specific object, trying to find what's the word? Well, direction asking, and it could be fractal, like where's library, not where is the library, or like where's bread, compared to a more like a casual where you're like, there could be slang, it could be formal, it could be like more advanced, where it is fractal, but you understand what's going on.
Right.
Like, what up?
So in these, say, a style like this, you would expect to hear more slang or deletions or shortened forms like what up versus, you know, if you walk into your doctor's office, you would probably not expect like what up.
Yeah, what up?
Right? Even though that's not super formal, but it's a higher level, right, than casual with your friends. And even like this, the kind of vocabulary you would expect to hear probably more unusual words in an oratorical kind of style or deliberative style than you would expect to hear maybe in the casual style as well. And this is important because it's kind of connected to the idea of register or level of formality in the language that our students will use. They have to kind of learn to understand certain vocabulary words are appropriate in these styles, whereas down here, you know, we might talk about chewing, whereas up here you would use mastication, or you know, that's your vocabulary.
That's what I'm saying.
It's chew. Why do we have a word which is what's wrong with chew? We have chew already. I don't know why we need masticate, but it exists. It exists for the orators of the world. That is why. So that Winston Churchill talked about it.
Masticating, bro.
Kind of like the word in oh my gosh, that show which solved it. What do we call it? There's a bunch of science geeks. Which one?
Big Ben theory?
Big Bang, yeah.
Oh, Big Bang theory. That's a big
That's
one.
what. Yeah, he said the word fornicate. And I'm like, what? I had to look it up. And I'm like, oh my God. Right. His vocabulary was, you know, made up there. I'm like, how did that make it? So once you got it, then it was over there. It's fine. But yeah. Simple words.
But you know, depending on the style that you're in, some of those vocabulary words wouldn't feel, whatever the alternative would be to fornicate, wouldn't feel right probably in these styles.
But he was always in the more.
Yeah, he's always up there, right?
He talked like he was, but then he was really, he's in the circle of about it.
And so that's a good observation, right? It feels weird, right? That's why it's funny. That's why it's funny that he's in this setting, but he's using the style as if he's in one of these settings.
Yeah.
And so this is a great point, Tony, that this is why our students have to be able to understand different styles. That if they're using words and phrases and like, how are you, kind sir, rather than what up, you know? The pragmatic use of language isn't, they're not accomplishing the function that they thought that they were trying to, because they're using the wrong style for it.
So I was telling Dr. that I ran into this situation years ago. This is before I knew anything about this whole thing about linguistics. So I was at, do you know where Sandwich was hired?
Oh,
Okay, so it's like glass, very rural, corn, you know, farmers community. And the Sandwich Fair is huge fair that comes every year. And they have vendors of all, right? So we had this vendor there that has some, you know, and I don't know, they're definitely United States, I don't know what country they're from, it's other than accent English. But their English was very formal. And when they were trying to talk about, you know, have conversations with their customers that were from rural America, the customers started acting like they were being insulted. And I was standing back thinking, why is it being combative? But the person that learned English as a second language, I guess they learned English in a more academic.
they probably went to like British school, maybe, or like in the style of a British school, and so they were speaking the Queen's
And they didn't
English.
realize the way they were saying their words, or like they were talking down to.
Right. So
Locals.
Yeah, so there's a breakdown in communication in terms of what's expected from a very sort of salt of the earth, rural American, and what that group of people associates with, you know, our perceptions of like, I think all things British seem like empty. So it comes across as like putting on airs when that's not at all sort of what was intended. This is just how they understand English. This is what they've been taught, right?
That's what they were taught.
Yeah. So again, it's all these pragmatic aspects of a level of style, and even in that case, you know, I mean, some of it's just accent, which you can't, which it's hard to sort of sort out what's triggering what in terms of the problem. But I think in the big picture, there's a breakdown in terms of style and the form not matching the function of what they're trying to accomplish in these pragmatic ways. But that's a great example.
We are out of time at this point, so we got through most of this actually. There's probably going to be a couple of minutes that I recommend you watch of the video lecture. So I'll post that on what moment we start at to sort of finish out the last couple of slides. But other than that, make sure you're just following the task list for week 11. That's all I got. Have a great week.
So we had a hug now?
We have to start 15 minutes ago. You're mad at me.
Make sure no one's mad at no one.
I had to teach my daughter that. We moved in with my parents, she was 12, 13. And in our home with her dad, we didn't do the whole kissing thing. So she continued that when we moved in with my parents. My mom was looking at her. So Veronica, make sure you say good night, good morning every day.
Yeah.
Because or else they're going to think they did something wrong. There's something wrong.
Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenos días.
Yeah. Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Very specific.
Hasta mañana. Yeah. No. Very Mexican. I remember that. I still do that.
No, not yet, but it's my parents. This is just the way it is here in this country. She's not saying anything.
She's not trying to be rude, yeah.
Go in the room. Oh my God.
Mine was slang. They didn't want me to slang in the house because they sounded very. Spanish, speak proper Spanish all the time.
All the time, yeah.
They don't care about it anymore. Have a good one.